Part 3. Free will continued. As I said at the end of my last video, if a thing is conceptually possible, it must be metaphysically possible. If a thing is not metaphysically possible, it must not be conceptually possible. If free will is conceptually possible, it must be metaphysically possible. But if so, determinism must be false. Before identifying the structural and conceptual problems of the argument against free will, I want to quickly give one more example of our experience and knowledge of freedom. Take the novel I, Robot by Isaac Asimov, one of my all-time favorites. It consists of a series of short stories with a common theme. Robots which follow a set of deterministic rules seem to behave in ways that are non-deterministic. Each story is a kind of logical whodunit in which the main character is able to determine how, without violating the three laws of robotics, the robots are able to perform various actions which seem conscious and free of their programming. At the end of each story we find that, despite all appearances, the robots weren't free after all. Some special circumstances made it seem as if they were free, but in fact they were merely obeying the laws in a strange situation. Well, I think that many people would read I, Robot and see it as an apologia for determinism, and perhaps Isaac Asimov partly intended it to be so, but in fact it is quite the opposite. The intellectual experience of the readers of I, Robot, while pondering the mysterious behavior of its robots, actually demonstrates everything that I am saying. For while it is true that the robots were never actually free in the story, it takes a certain kind of mind to discern that fact. Because the reader knows something about free deliberative action and some of its superficial characteristics, acting in unanticipated ways for example, he wonders if the robots are free. But for the very same reason, because he understands freedom, he is able to discover that they are not free after all. A deterministic robot following the laws of robotics would not be able to make this distinction, for he would have neither the experience of freedom to draw upon nor the conceptual faculty for comparing freedom to determinism. Only because we are already aware of freedom can we ask whether or not we are free. Now on to the argument for determinism. The argument restated in syllogistic form is as follows. 1. Every action is an event necessitated by prior events. 2. The events we call free choices are actions, so the conclusion is the events we call free choices are necessitated by prior events. Now I've come to see this argument as similar to Anselm's ontological argument for the existence of God, and then the argument seems to have something wrong with it, but it's not immediately apparent what that is exactly. The comments that follow may therefore seem a bit ad hoc, but I will try to draw them together at the end. Okay, the first problem I see with this argument is that it doesn't actually disprove free will. The universal premise states that every action is an event which is necessitated by prior events. The particular premise states that the events we call free choices are actions. Therefore, actions are events necessitated by prior events. In other words, this is simply a restatement of the principle of sufficient reason in the mode of causality, and as such it is axiomatic. But the claim about free will is not that human actions are causeless. Rather, it is that human beings are the cause of their actions. My actions are necessitated by prior events, namely the events of my choice. This is only possible if we assume that human beings are conscious, deliberative animals that can consider multiple possibilities and choose to act on one or the other, which is what they seem to be. It's only impossible if we assume that human beings are not really such entities, but instead are entirely reducible to and explicable as bottom-up mechanism, which seems problematic. But notice that these assumptions cannot be proved or derived from the terms of the argument itself. That brings us to the second problem with the argument. If the determinist wants to avoid the problem, he might rephrase the argument thus. 1. Every action is an event reducible to material causes and necessitated by prior material events. 2. The events we call free choices are actions. Therefore, the events we call free choices are events reducible to material causes and necessitated by prior material events. Does that argument hold any water? Well, it's valid, but only if we accept the claim that every action is an event reducible to material causes and necessitated by prior material events is it sound. But certainly the determinist cannot ask us to take that claim for granted, for it is not self-evident that everything is physical, and there are many things in our experience, ideas, numbers, aesthetic properties, logic, ethics, the conscious experience of ourselves, etc., that do not seem reducible to material causes or beings, or at least not fully reducible. Perhaps they are, but additional arguments would be required to establish that claim. One cannot simply take it as given. Yet that is precisely what is going on when the argument for determinism is used to prove materialism. We are asked to believe that materialism is true because everything is materially deterministic, which is circular reasoning. A third problem with the argument is of a totally different kind, and I will not cover it in a complete detail here, as it will be the subject of a later video. But the problem can be stated simply. If it's true that every event is necessitated by prior events, then we must either proceed backwards in an infinite series of prior events, or, if the principle of causality holds, then we must eventually arrive at an actor which is not an actee, a mover which is not itself moved. But if so, there must be at least something in the universe which can transcend the causal chain in the sense of not being a product of it. But if that is the case, it is possible that there are other things in the world, perhaps somehow related to the first thing, which can also transcend to some degree this causal chain, which can initiate events and in a certain respect be the cause of their own actions. In any event, since determinism depends on a chain of necessitarian causality, but since this is a chain of finite things which cannot go back forever, the chain itself must terminate in an uncaused cause, or else we must give up determinism. If the latter, then so much for determinism. But if the former, then determinism in the sense of an absolute metaphysical necessity of dependent causality cannot be true, because it can't go back forever. So it's self-refuting once again. For something, and possibly some things, is or are free to transcend the causal chain, and thus are not determined in the sense that the determinist intends. Okay. So to sum up our presentation, first we noted that determinism entails that freedom is not possible in any kind of a possible world. Second, we noted that determinists concede that we have a sense or experience of freedom. Third, that this sense must be an illusion, delusion, or a false experience of reality. 4, that forms of compatibilism which concede determinism cannot offer us a way out of determinism, although they may be useful in understanding higher-order deterministic behavior, such as that of animals or robots. 5, that evolution and ignorance have been offered as explanations for the false experience of free will. 6, that these explanations fail to convince. 7, that we do in fact have a conceptual and experiential knowledge of freedom. 8, that if we can conceptualize and experience something, it must be logically and metaphysically possible. 9, that freedom is conceptually and metaphysically possible, therefore it is not impossible in those respects. 10, that therefore there must be something wrong with the argument for determinism. 11, that at least the following things are wrong with it. A, that freedom is causality and therefore does not contradict causality, provided man is the sort of being whose nature can account for free choices. B, that materialist reductionism does not follow from determinism unless we implicitly or explicitly assume it to be the case, which assumption cannot be derived from the argument in any event. C, that a reductionist determinism cannot account for the series of causes upon which it depends. Obviously, there is much more to this discussion, but I am content that the deterministic bugaboo has been defanged. I had to stop short in order to keep this a 3-part video, which has already run over what I originally planned, within reasonable time bounds. I would like at some point in the future to go into some additional problems I found with determinism. In any event, it seems clear to me that, given the considerations raised here, the burden of proof falls on the materialist determinist to prove his case. Later on in this series, which is about God, liberty, and emergentism, I will address physical reductionism more directly and argue that this way of looking at the world is fundamentally flawed. Thank you for your time, and I will see you later. Bye-bye.